Barbara Bartocci was the research fellow on the Leverhulme-funded project that we had here, where we've edited Paula Venice's treatise on insolubles, and that's at that press at the moment. We're now continuing to work on John Dumbleton's treatise, which Barbara is going to talk about now, and Walter Seagrave's treatise, which I'll talk about at 3:15. So over to you, Barbara.
Thanks. So thanks not only for giving me the floor, but for involving me in this project. It was very, very interesting to work on this subject. And what we are presenting today is a very first result of this work, this 3 years work. One of the 3 points of the project was the critical edition of John Dumbleton, Summa Logicae et Philosophiae Naturalis. Here you can see one folio taken from one of the 21 manuscripts preserved in the work. So the work has been conducted on actually 19 manuscripts of the Summa Logicae. Now, a few words on John Dumbleton before we start, because it's not so known, and actually we cannot know so much, because from the records we have, we know that he was active in Oxford and was a member of the Oxford calculators in, let's say, by the end of the 1330s. And then he might have spent just 3 years in Paris studying theology, but that's not sure. And plausibly in Oxford, he wrote his massive work. As you can see, the entire Summa Logicae Philosophiae Naturalis runs to about, to some, let's say, 400,000 words. And the part that we are publishing is 26,000 words. Now, what we are going to look at today is, if you look here at the manuscript, we have the tabula, which was a kind of index for those people of the content of the manuscript, which was not quite easy to run through. The whole book, the Summa Logicae Philosophiae Naturalis, contains 9 parts, but for those who wish to read the Latin, here where I'm pointing, it should have contained 10 parts, the last of which perhaps has never been written because Dumbleton perhaps death because of the Black Death, so at the end of the 40s. Today we are looking at the first column you see here, which is the part of the Summa Logicae, so the first book of the Summa Logicae Philosophiae Naturalis, which consists of a first treatise indicated here that deals with signification of terms. And unlike what we have seen in the previous days, and especially, for example, yesterday with Marsilius, we should not expect to find the kind of formal semantics here, but it's more a kind of psychological semantics we will see later. Immediately after that treatise follows the treatise on insolubles, which is quite long. As you can see, it's from where I'm, I hope you can see my pointer. So it's roughly almost the middle of this column. And then there is a short part on epistemic paradoxes, and eventually on how do we get knowledge of the so-called first principles. So today the plan is to follow Dumbleton's own plan, so to lay down some epistemological foundations of Dumbleton's semantics, at least what seems to me to be the foundation of his semantics. Then we will look at Dumbleton's semantics, so his theory of signification of mental proposition, mental terms or intentions, as he calls them. And we will touch briefly on his theory of truth, which, not surprisingly, is a correspondence theory of truth. And this, I hope, will clarify, let's say, pave the way for what we will do later, which is perhaps the most interesting part for those who attend the workshop on paradoxes. So Dumbleton's solution to semantic paradoxes and then how he applies his principle for solving some of the most debated paradoxical sentences debated in medieval teaching classrooms. So we can start now by looking at the epistemological foundation of Dumbleton semantics. So basically, I'm sorry for those who are quite acquainted with medieval theory of knowledge or epistemology to summarize something which is perhaps known. Now, Dumbleton identifies 4 stages in our cognitive process, which basically coincide with a first act of perceiving and then 3 acts of the mind, which are quite known. But we can read Dumbleton himself. So there are 4 acts of ours which are naturally produced by an object of cognition. So the first act is to perceive, sentire, once an impression, motus, is produced in the sense, which is capable to move it. So basically, what's that? Is the external stimulus that is received. It is produced by a thing, and with thing, we should imagine even linguistic items. So a written thing, the shape of the words, my words floating in the air. These are also things in his framework, is in his, let's say, ontology. And those things have some peculiar features, which he calls likenesses, intentiones, the intention of a thing. And this likeness of a thing is what is received once we receive an external stimulus. For example, now that I'm speaking, is the intentio of my voice is a specific frequency of the sound, or the white of this the white of my PowerPoint is a specific wavelength of this color, and so on. And then once we have received that, we can perform the second act, which is no more at the level of senses, but it's already an intellectual act. The second intellectual act, the second act is the simple comprehension, apprehensio, of the intellect, which immediately follows the impression produced by an intention. So actually, once the perceptual areas are activated, and thanks to the mediation of this intentio ray, what happens in us is that we are able to recall what he calls, I'm sorry for the repetition of the term, but it's Dumbleton terminology, what he calls an intentio, which when it's not associated with intentio ray, we should understand as a kind of mental representation or a concept. So once we receive an impression, then we can, for example, recall from what we have stored the impression of cold, in my case, because I have cold hands at this moment. Now, a basic question that someone might raise is, how do we acquire such stored mental representation? We don't know, because unfortunately what we have seen before here, the 10th part that lacks, should have explained to people how these intentions are acquired, whether they are empirically formed or innate, we don't know. When we talk here in this talk of intention, Dumbleton has already given this for acquired and just thinks of something that has happened. So we have stored in our mind various concepts or mental representations. And when we, thanks to the stimuli, get to recall to the mind this information stored, we can perform the third act of the mind, that is to form a thought, componere, by means of a simple comprehension, apprensione. And this act is called by him the copula propositionis, the copula of the proposition. I don't know how to put it in more, let's say, contemporary terms. So actually it's the act whereby the mind couples or separates two intentions by affirmation or denial. Once this act is performed, we can perform a fourth act, which is, as he says, to assert, deny, or express doubt about that same thought. So actually is what today falls in the propositional attitude field. Now, the important thing is that each of the three acts, so to apprehend, to form comprehension, form a thought, and assert, deny, or express doubt about something. So each act presupposes the act that precedes it. So the basic one is apprehension. Once we have it, we can form a thought, and then only once we have formed a thought, we can eventually assert. Okay. Not surprisingly for Dumbleton, given what we have said, the true signification when we want to express something is in our thought and not in our spoken or written terms. And he says this clearly by claiming that in things outside the soul, there is neither composite nor incomposite signification. Thus it follows that propositions and all proper signification subsist only in the soul. So now we can look first at what does it mean for an intention or mental representation and for a mental proposition to signify. As to the intentions, they are defined by Dumbleton as instruments. He says here clearly, an intention is a natural means by which the soul or an ensouled being naturally apprehends when a thing's intention actually prompts it to apprehend, which is basically what we have seen in the previous slides, to receive an input from the outside and then activate our mental faculty to recall the intention which is associated with this stimulus in our mind. Now, the signification of an intention, as he says, is natural, which means that it cannot change. A simple intention, that's the second quotation, signifies a thing and cannot signify other things, whether the things exist or not, which is something that differentiates an intention, the signification of an intention, from the signification of a spoken or written term, which can instead change its significate. And is natural insofar as is not the result of a process of learning by practice, let's say. This intention can be seen, we can say, as the basic units of our mental propositions. That's because every intention of a thing prompts naturally the mind to form a thought. So once we receive the impression, the task we have to perform is not just to apprehend it, but to eventually try to form a thought concerning what we have received, so to model our thought on the basis of the reality we have perceived. Okay, once we have acquired that, we can eventually pass to the following act, which is the act of let's say compounding, form, as he says, a complexum, starting from these building blocks, which are intentions. Now, once we have this, we have recalled the intentions, we can then perform the act of coupling, either, let's say, to say that something is, so we do not actually couple, but just we should say acknowledge that something is or exists, or we couple something, so two intentions between them. We see that Socrates is white, and so we couple the intention of Socrates with the general concept of white. So as to the proposition, the act of compounding produces what I've called here unasserted mental propositions. Dumbleton clearly says that mental propositions are taken in two ways. First, by not having towards them an act of doubting or believing or being uncertain, but only by grasping them so that they signify in some way. So as I said, the example he gives is that of mental proposition saying that the king is sitting. So actually, what we are doing when we compound this thought is just to entertain or merely think that something is or is not. Is just the entertainment of propositional content. Once we have that, we can pass to the fourth act and have asserted mental propositions. In the second way, we comprehend mental propositions, complexa, insofar as they signify as things are or as things are not, proved significant. And these thoughts were, so basically our entertaining the thought that the propositional content is as we think can be expressed in our judgment about that can be expressed in two ways. Either we say that in a direct way it is true or false, or I doubt that the king is sitting, or we can form a thought, this is true, which refers to what I've thought previously, the king is sitting. This is false, referring to that same proposition, or I doubt that, referring to that same proposition. So what we have said so far is quite, let's say, coherent with his view concerning truth. So from the objective side of the proposition, a proposition is true insofar or false insofar as things are or are not in reality as the proposition says. He states his, let's say, correspondence view concerning truth quite clearly, and read here the quotation. The first postulate is this: every affirmative proposition is made true or made false directly or indirectly by a simple thing. So directly, this is clear. We take a proposition and then we look at outside in the world how things are. Indirectly, so if it is indirectly, then we can postulate, for example, let's consider proposition A to be a true proposition. Now, if it is indirectly verified, let be a proposition which directly makes A true, then B is directly made true either by something complex or something simple. Whichever you choose, he says, since an infinite regress is impossible, there must finally be one proposition which is elicited directly from a simple thing, which is the cause of truth of all the other ones. And as to falsity, a simple thing or its absence is the cause of the falsehood of the proposition, insofar as a falsehood has a cause. Actually, here is kind of avoiding the loop of having token sentences referring to other sentences for having their truth value, so that none of them is eventually grounded. An interesting side then of his theory of truth is that he also gives us a way of how we use the semantic predicates true and false. And I quote, he says that we use the term true when some proposition is comprehended by us to signify as things are, the term false is used by us when we believe that some proposition is false, that is, that it signifies other than things are. So, for example, if someone makes an assertion, so the fourth act, he only says this is true or this is false, and can do that only insofar as he earlier comprehended some proposition which he believes to be true or false, for which, so comprehended, he then proposes this is true and this is false. Now, so far we have a very, very quick, I hope not too confounding overview of his semantics of intentions and mental proposition. Now, mental proposition usually is what verifies or gives signification to the level of spoken and written linguistic items. So, as is clear for him, a term signify only insofar as it has a relation of signification with something that is in our mind. Because if we take a term, whatever term you can read on this slide, by itself, it has actually, if there is no relation of signification, it has no meaning. It might have potentially every meaning you wish, because you can establish with, for example, the term here, semantic, the signification you wish. And this is done in a way that he explained here in this quotation. For a term, where for term we intend written or spoken, to signify something in an incomposite way, so not in a proposition, is to actualize, that is, to call to mind that thing's intention by means of the term's proper intention, and thus, and that thing is said to be signified by that term in normal usage. So, and then he continues, a term signifying to someone is nothing other than that terms call into mind the true intention of something else by means of the term's proper intention, while being ignorant of a term is merely comprehending nothing but the terms by means of the term's intentions. So looking, for example, at something written in a language which you don't comprehend means for us to be ignorant, while to read the slides here and understanding, associate to each word some concept, means to be able to understand that. And it's very interesting, something I've not specified here, but is treated at length by Dumbleton, how we do come to acquire this signification is a process of repeated association that we have since we are children, and is done in a very, let's say, really by practice. So the first time, for example, a teacher or a parent or whoever you wish shows us a blank piece of paper, and then we have our intention in the mind of white, and then our teacher starts uttering the word white, white. So we repeat this association, and eventually we acquire language. And as he says, it's just a matter of usage, and is also a matter of social convention, because there is, as he says clearly, there is no problem in associating the intention white with the name horse. The only problem is that nobody in your linguistic environment makes the same association. So by usage, that comes to be a bad association. Now, but how do terms map onto intentions? They might map one-to-one, so there is no problem in cases with intentions like, for example, it is man or white. There is one one single, let's say, relation between an intention and the linguistic item. That's it. So other times there's a problem and we have one-to-many mapping. So the linguistic expression doesn't pair a unique intention or meaning, if you wish, with a unique referent. So for example, if we think to the term pen, now since I'm close to my desk, I immediately think to the writing tool, while if I'm in a farm, perhaps I think to the chicken place. So this creates a problem at the level of language. He says that in one of the conclusions he lays down before replying to, or better, trying to solve insolubles, he says that there does not correspond to every universal term a universal intention in the mind. This is clear like this. There are equivocal terms which do not signify their supposita by a single reason, because we lack universal intentions in respect of equivocals. Equivocals are not predicated of their supposita by a single reason. There is not by a single intention. But it is not the only case of one-to-many mappings. This might happen even with semantic predicates like true and false, which is what is more interesting for us. Okay, I think we can skip this, otherwise I fear we will be late. Now, so the basic thing with these terms that do not have a one-to-one mapping is that in case of one-to-many mapping, we need to disambiguate the term. So whenever we see the term in context, we should try to recall to mind the right intention that is associated to it. And this type of, we might call disambiguation or assignment of a referent, should happen also in the case of determinatives, since in themselves the demonstrative pronouns like this refer to something only insofar we can assign to them a reference. For example, he gives us the example of a proposition that in what is in a perhaps obligational context, or in any case in a classroom context, was perhaps proposed to a student who had eventually to say if it is true or false. So consider the proposition called A here. This is a man. This kind of sentences, he says, are not comprehensible, intelligibles, because every pronoun lacking reference is void, cassum, and empty. In the proposed scenario, in proposition A, nothing determinate is referred to through the pronoun this. Therefore, proposition A is not comprehensible. Therefore, it should not be asserted, denied, or doubted. So it seems that here a proposition like that fails to express a proposition in contemporary term, or fails to have a meaning. Now, to assign this, let's say, to disambiguate a proposition like the one we have seen, or a proposition like this exists, which refers to three items, for example, white items, we should form in our thought and then eventually express, if we wish, in written or spoken proposition, a conjunction of three propositions: a white thing exists, and a white thing exists, and a white thing exists. While in case the demonstrandum is not an object, but is, for example, a proposition, then we just have to substitute the demonstrative pronoun with the proposition itself. So in case we have proposition A here at the bottom of the slide, this exists, which refers to B, that is, God exists, then when we understand this proposition, so assign a reference, we should think God exists. And from the logical viewpoint, says Dumbleton, A and C are equivalent propositions. So far, so good. So once we know what the terms signify, we are perhaps entitled to make the first step and try to understand what a proposition signifies. The term proposition itself, as he says, can be comprehended in two ways. In one way, it's just the object of hearing or what I see, and this is the way in which illiterates comprehend a proposition. So they just see something written on paper without understanding or without recalling to mind an intention. While people who understand truly a proposition, what do is to recall the mental intention corresponding to the term they see, and then perform the act of coupling the the intention with an eventual other intention, or just to make an existential predication. And then we have a proposition. We have understood the proposition. Now, I think we can skip this, otherwise it's... Okay, we can now have some ingredients for seeing how we can eventually arrive at finding a solution to semantic paradoxes. As we have seen in the previous days, Dumbleton follows the custom of medieval authors writing on insolubles, so he lays down divisions which actually are kind of dichotomies that arrive eventually at the definition of the subject. So what is an insoluble proposition? Then he lays down his conclusions. So the conclusions more important in my view are the first one, which is something that after what I've been saying perhaps doesn't sound so strange. A term signifies only insofar as and while there is an actual comprehension through it. The third conclusion that he lays down says that no proposition in the mind is comprehended through a simple intention, but through a proposition, he says, per complexum. So basically we can form a thought about a mental proposition only if something complex is actually comprehended. And from this follows immediately that the fourth conclusion, the subject or predicate of any proposition signifying a proposition, pro complexo, is a proposition, and the proposition corresponds to one or both. So the subject, actually, if we consider, it's perhaps easier, a proposition like a falsehood exists or a truth exists. Let's suppose that I'm entertaining this thought or writing a falsehood exists or uttering that. In order to do that, I should already have had in my mind a thought to which this subject falsehood refers. Now, what is an insoluble according to him? He describes an insoluble as a proposition such that from an apparently possible scenario admitted ex apparenti casu possibili admisso, it is inferred that it is true and it is false. So he adopts a contextualist approach, which is framed in the context of obligations, the casus, and then we will see detailed in a few slides various scenarios that were proposed perhaps in classrooms. This approach means that no proposition in its own right can be considered an insoluble, but possibly any proposition might turn out to be a paradoxical proposition under specific circumstances. Now, for understanding Dumbleton solution, then we have also to keep in mind that in this obligational context, an important rule for obligation was, I hope I don't say something untrue because there are experts of obligations here, but a rule seems to be that depositum, so the first proposition in this obligational discussion, can't be an impossible or a paradoxical proposition. Otherwise, for my opponent, will be quite easy to win on me. So such proposition should be rejected. And this is connected also with an approach which Stephen has mentioned in his first talk, that is the approach of the cassantes. We eventually then, through this contextualist approach, let's say, arrived at saying that proposition, like insoluble, fail to express a specific context. Now, this having been said, I wanted to look with you at some specific scenarios, because Dumbleton really goes through as if he was thinking to scholarly activity. He was looking at various scenarios. So let's consider, for example, the case of indirect self-reference. So propositions like a truth exists, a falsehood exists. The usual scenario has that there is only one proposition of some sort. Let's say a truth exists. The subject of this proposition signifies a proposition, as we have seen before. So when we are put in front of such scenarios, what we have to do, he says, is that we have to deny this scenario, or not to admit is the same, has been impossible because, he says, A is a proposition signifying in some way for a complex. By the third and fourth conclusion, which we have seen before, a proposition other than A should correspond to the subject of A, truth. But in this scenario, there is no other proposition. So truth here has no referent and seems to be meaningless. If we look at the scenario of a direct self-reference, like the liar sentence, quite famous, this is false. If we put these sentences in a scenario where this is, so there are two levels, as we have seen, the mental and the spoken and written. Let's start with the mental one. If we look at this is false in a scenario in which it is the only mental proposition, now the subject refers to itself and signifies only in this way. And this last caveat, signifies only in this way, was perhaps to avoid any implicational meaning. When we are in a discussion that has this starting point, he says that we should deny such scenarios. So we should not enter in a discussion that set this stage, negatur casus, because it is impossible. And why it is impossible? It is impossible because if A is understood through its subject, then when Socrates understands his subject, this, so the demonstrative pronoun, he actually comprehends proposition A entirely. And so the entire proposition A would be prior to its copula, and so it would exist before I perform the act that would eventually produce the proposition. As I understand it, it seems to me a kind of reformulation of the restriction in terms of signification rather than in mereological terms, plus supposition. So usually self-restriction was that the term cannot, a part cannot signify for the whole of which is it part, or a term cannot suppose it for its proposition, the proposition of which is it part. Now, so in this case, we should deny as impossible if it is mental. But if the proposition is the same proposition, this is false is just uttered or written, now we should respond that the scenario is not comprehensible casus non est intelligibilis, because it's not specified what the speaker who has uttered or the writer who has written such proposition means. And so the term this remains unknown to me, the hearer. So one should respond by expressing doubt about how the term signify. The same holds true, he says, in the case of the truth teller. In a scenario in which this is true is written, we should express doubt, because it is required that one comprehends the terms before he can respond to the question concerning the truth or falsehood of that proposition. For example, this is true. And this gives us also a reply to what is nowadays known as Carre's paradox. So if we find an inference, or we are proposed an inference like this inference is good, so a man is an ass, which is written, the solution that Dumbleton proposes is to express doubt about the scenario, because this whole inference is referred to by the term this. So that the same term this is referred to by itself. And so the term this, insofar as it is the subject of the premise, signifies nothing other than itself. But because this is required before this term signify complexly, so from the scenario, complete signification is not given, from which truth or falsity results in these terms. Now, if we look at direct loops, so when a proposition or in indirect falsification, let's consider the proposition every truth is one of these in a scenario in which, at the first stage, we have a proposition that is called A, God exists, or if you are an atheist, 1 equals 1. B is another true proposition, that is a man is an animal. And then comes Socrates and thinks, oh, every truth is one of these, and refers to A and B. Now, what should we do in such a scenario? Dumbleton says the scenario can easily be admitted, and we should say, if we are asked if every truth is one of these, which seems to pose a problem belonging to the liar family, we should say that chi is a true proposition because chi is a mental proposition signifying a proposition, and there is no proposition other than C except A and B. It is clear by the third conclusion of Dumbleton that A or B or both, conjunctively or disjunctively, are the subjects of C, and so C signify only each of these, God exists and a man exists is one of these, is true. Well, I will skip the indirect loop where a proposition refers to another and each one presupposes the existence of the other. What we should do, briefly said, we should deny such scenarios, because we have the impossibility that a proposition presupposes the existence of another proposition, which in its turn presupposes the existence of the previous propositions, the two which we see here on the top. Another possible scenarios is that we have some external acts like saying, hearing, seeing, and there is a proposition whose subject or predicate signifies only itself. So Socrates says a falsehood, where, for example, Socrates is the only Socrates and utters just this proposition. In such a scenario, where Socrates is a falsehood and only that, and is the only Socrates existing, the scenario is admitted. And how can we respond? If to this extramental proposition uttered, Socrates is a falsehood, corresponds in the mind of the utterer a true mental proposition, then we can say that our Socrates is a falsehood is true. If to Socrates is a falsehood in the mind corresponds, sorry, is the reverse. If it is true, then it is false. If it is true in our mind, the proposition corresponding to that, then the uttered proposition is false, and vice versa. If a false mental proposition corresponds to Socrates as a falsehood, then this is true. Dumbleton does not say if we do not know, we shall perhaps doubt the proposition. And then the last thing I wanted to look at is epistemic paradoxes. So those involving believing, being deceived, and so on, such acts. So we have a scenario in which it is assumed that someone, Socrates, believes only one proposition, and the subject of this proposition or its predicate signifies the proposition. For example, Socrates believes Socrates is deceived. Now, in such scenarios, the scenario should not be admitted because in order for Socrates to believe himself to be deceived, he should know something to be true for now, which he previously believed to be false. So it is presupposed, if we want to put this and close the circle, in order to perform this fourth act of the mind, we need to have performed a previous act, but in this scenario, there is nothing else but the proposition Socrates is deceived. So this does not refer to anything. Now, luckily, I've not written conclusions because I'm running out of time, and also because, as I said, it's a work in progress. So apart from these quite evident things which we have seen, so how he replies to that, the point is how we should understand these replies. So from the viewpoint of how it diagnoses and solve insolubles, whether we insolubles, as I think, are just actually ungrounded proposition, or proposition that in a specific scenario fail to be truth apt if the scenario is put in place, but are propositions which potentially are truth apt. So if we take this is false out of the scenario, it can be assigned a truth value. Now, as you can see here, at the end of the treatise on insoluble, here, Dumbleton says, okay, this is what I think is a good opinion. And the last three sentences here invite the reader, if he finds, she finds a better solution, he says, to grata fiat compensatio, which is something I ask you for the Q&A. And thanks for your attention.
Good, thank you very much, Barbara. So there's some rich material there, particularly about loops. So questions from the audience. So Manuel Darquist has a question.
Barbara, congratulations. Very original and very interesting, your work. And the Dumbleton proposed is very original for me. I need clarifying some ideas, particularly respect to the pronoun this. Yes, this is a singular term, and for the same is immediate term, and for the same is epistemic clear term. And in the Dumbleton propose this, preserve this epistemic clarity or lost. I don't have clear this point. Yes, in Paulus Venetus, in the distinction between immediately and mediately terms are singular terms, be singular terms, and for this reason, is the last term, is the epistemic clear term. Here, I don't comprehend the place of the this. Can you agree some explanation for the point? Thanks.
Thanks for the question. Actually, it's unfortunately is not as clear as Paulus Venetus, because when he speaks of those themes, those topics, for example, this is just in epistemic terms, but not in relation to such a specific taxonomy as we find in, for example, Paul. So if you look for a very technical discussion in Dumbleton, unfortunately, you won't find anything. Just to give you an idea, from how he writes, he seems to equate, to consider as synonymous suppositio and signification. He used them interchangeably. Just to give you an idea of how far we are from these technical discussions. So I'm sorry I cannot give you a satisfying answer, because it's not there, unfortunately, in the text. He deals with those issues just in epistemic terms mainly. So it's just a matter of very easy things, how we substitute. So the most technical thing I found is the one that, in case you have this referring to treating, then you have a conjunction. That's it. So his discussion is never framed in terms of supposition theory, or if he speaks of supposition, it's just a general use of supposition. Never, you will never find, for example, a reference to suppositio discreta confusa, or materialis. So I'm sorry. I hope that replies to your question.
We've got a queue, so we better move on. Dov Gabe, sorry, I missed your first comment. So you have a question, Dov? You need to unmute yourself.
Only it's fine for me.
Yeah. Can I came in on the second half of the lecture. So, but from what I can see there's something that may be relevant. Some years ago, in Vienna, I participated in a conference on ancient Indian logic, and it was similar to this one. They were studying manuscripts and looking at the way they're answering some fundamental question. And one of the lectures on one of the schools was the school was committed to, if you use a term as a subject or an object, if you use a term, it has to exist. And the problem that they had is the carpenter example, and that is, you see a carpenter making a cupboard, but the cupboard doesn't yet exist. So how can he say, or how can we talk about what he's making? Is there something similar problem here? Because from your latest slides, it seems same kind of talk.
Yes, it's more, let's say, it's more, he looks more at the intentional side of things than the extensional side. So it's really a matter of how do we understand. And that seems to me to be the main preoccupation in his mind.
I see. So, what if I say, I go to the king and say, I like to make you a cupboard like this? And then the king said, it's already been made by the carpenter. When he say it, he's referring as a subject.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's not a problem?
It depends on the context. If, for example, he points, it's fine. I understand. From the context, I might be able to understand. There's no need to specify it, because from what we are saying, it's clear. But if you refer to me just the last proposition without saying that the subject was the carpenter, then yes, I have a big problem. For me, what you are saying is not comprehensible, does not have a full meaning, because I cannot refer you to something.
So one last, if I say I love God, and you fully understand what I'm talking about, does this prove there is God? From the fact that this is well formed?
No, I don't think so.
Or God loves me? Or we're all loved by God? Now God is the subject? Now
here I think the problem with this specific subject is now the meaning of what you say with God. He says he's an intention. We have the intention, mental representation, of call whatever you want, of God. This signifies naturally. So if it signifies naturally, I assume that it's the same for anyone. The point is that here there might be a problem for to reply this question, I think we should know how do we have this intention, which is something we cannot know in this case, because it's a part of a treatise that has either never been written or got lost. So while if we stick at the language level, then if, for example, we have the same religious background, I can understand what you say, because we use the word God in the same way. So according to the specific features that in our linguistic context God has.
So does it mean that a very tight, clever, well-informed group?
So I can't hear.
Someone muted me. Sorry, I'm apologising to you, Dov, to cut you off, but there's a long queue which we won't be able to get through. So I'll turn to two more questions, which I think is as much as we can probably afford without going over time too much. So the next person to ask a question is Miroslav Hanka. You have several questions, you say, Miroslav, but you'll have to limit yourself to the best one.
Oh, the best one. Okay. So,
but I can stay here during the break if you wish.
Okay, good. Okay, so the best one. Oh, so much pressure. Do you have any hypothesis on the relative chronology of Dumbleton's Installabilia and Sophismata Asinina attributed to Heytesbury? The reason why I'm asking is that the occurrence of Carr's paradox, because I would be actually genuinely interested in who invented the paradox. And at this point, my favorite, I was kind of believing that it was Heytesbury, but now, obviously, this would be a deal breaker. So I wonder who got the idea first, because it's an interesting kind of paradox.
Now, the point is that I have a span of about 10 years, so I'm not sure whether this might be useful. So let's say the 40s of the 14th century. He refers to Heytesbury because he has everyone, he gives the list of opinions. And one so is Barley, Bradwardine, Swansted, and Hesbury. So these are the four. And
he's probably referencing regular, I suppose, or the solution in regular.
Sorry?
When he's referencing Hesbury, he's probably referencing regular solution sophismata. Does that sound about right?
I don't recall exactly.
He probably doesn't mention the title, yeah, that's obvious.
No,
but,
no. I mean,
what he says.
The identification is our plus the hand which wrote one of the 19 manuscripts has written the name on the side, which is something quite strange. But that's the only. I'm sorry, I cannot tell you more about that. Also, because it's quite hard to find an exact chronology for the work, and even the manuscript don't help at all.
Okay. Thank you.
I have a brief footnote on that, which is Spade questions whether one of the views talked about by Hesbury could be Dumbleton because of the reference from Dumbleton to Hesbury. But so the likelihood is that Hesbury is earlier than Dumbleton, but it's just possible that they're both there together at Oxford talking about this to one another. And we'll never know who got there first.
Okay.
The next question I have is from Graham White.
Hi. Very nice paper. He seems to have a very strong view on whether parts of a proposition can refer to the proposition as a whole. And he has this epistemic argument which says that you know in certain circumstances you can't do that because you wouldn't understand the part. If you're claiming to understand the part before you read the whole. What would you do with propositions like, if this proposition is false, then this proposition is true, which have a determinate truth value, but which have a but where the antecedent actually refers to the conditional as a whole?
He says that they can both. He treats similar questions. He says that in this case, some contradictory proposition can be true because they're not true contradictories in so far as they don't have the same referent. So if they point to the same thing, okay, that's a problem. But as you pose it, then there is the loop of presupposing the existence of something which presupposes in its turn the existence of the other thing. It seems a kind of loop, if I got you. It's an impossible position in as far as I can understand. But in any case, in some cases, it does not exclude that what he calls verbally contradictory proposition can both be true.
Yeah.
Okay. Nice one to puzzle over. And finally, there's a question from Dania Maslow.
Right. Yes. Thank you for a very interesting paper. And I've got a question about intentions. Whether there is an intention which somehow belongs to a thing, because a thing's intention, he says, actually prompts it, that is, the soul to apprehend. And on the other side, there's this term's intention. And moreover, intention signifies a thing, which is, well, say, a mental representation, or is it the term's intention which signifies really? I've got a little bit muddled about this. But can we say that there's something an echo of, say, Reveus Natalis' intention of an object of knowledge, like intentionality, which is on the side of the object, something like that here.
Okay, sorry.
Yes, that's it.
Okay, from the few information I could gather, because as I said, in the 10th party promised an extensive treatment of the question. So it seems you have those, there should be something in a thing. So for example, Socrates should naturally be white in order then to have this intention of the thing, which is some specific feature of the thing, that then I don't know whether he adopts the Aquanian's view about species or whatever. I haven't inquired in the transmission of the into the middle. Then this matches with what we have in mind. So there is a likeness between the two, and they recognize, let's say, each other, the intention of the thing. Like an ant, this is what I have in my mind. This intention travels in the air, is the intention of an object. And then when it arrives through my senses in my brain, I can recall this intention, they match. So the intentions thing and my mental intention match each other. The problem is how to have this stored already in my brain empirically. It's something innate we don't know, unfortunately. I assume, as far as I can see from what he writes, it seems quite likely to be an empirical thing, because he doesn't like the Stroman Plato. So it's quite hard to have an innate content for our intentions.
Thank you.